During the 1860 U.S. presidential election, Abraham Lincoln considered making Cassius Clay as his vice president, but instead opted to choose Hannibal Hamlin as his running mate to win the 1860 presidential election. Lincoln then replaced Hamlin with Andrew Johnson as vice president for the 1864 election, where Johnson was completely wasted during his inauguration and became president of the United States after Lincoln was assassinated. Now you might be asking to yourself, who is Cassius Clay? Well, only one of the most hardcore abolitionists and undefeated duelists to ever live. He became known as the deadliest duelist in North America by the time he graduated college, as he challenged so many pro-slavery dipwads to a duel and put them in the dirt as if they were plants. He survived quite a few assassination attempts in the 1840s and 1850s, including one in 1843, where during a political debate he was shot in the chest and then proceeded to whip out his trusted Bowie knife and carved up the gunman like he was a prehistoric cave. A lot of assassination attempts on him would end up kind of the same, where pro-slavery dudes get the living crap beaten out of them or would get ripped apart by Clay's knife. Cassius Clay also served in the Mexican-American War at the Battle of Buena Vista, and he and his men were captured by the Mexican army. Some of his men made an escape attempt, and the Mexicans wanted to execute them. So Clay said that as he was their commanding officer, that he should be killed instead of them, as their actions were his responsibility. At this point, the Mexicans were so impressed by Clay that they spared everyone's lives. After the war, Clay got into more fights where he tore up pro-slavery dudes like they were unwanted bills, and Clay was then considered to be Lincoln's running mate in the 1860 election. But Lincoln figured that Clay would be, well, too hardcore and chose Hamlin. But that didn't mean that Clay was just going to sit on the sidelines of the Civil War, of course. Lincoln made Cassius Clay as the U.S. ambassador to Russia, where not only did he reaffirm that Russia was not going to support the Confederates, but also got Russia to say that if Britain and France joined the Confederates, then Russia would declare war on them. This was very important because Britain and France were considering joining the U.S. Civil War to back the Confederates. But with Cassius Clay there, now there was a deterrent. Russia then sent their Pacific and Atlantic fleets to the east and west coast of the United States with instructions for if the British and French joined the Civil War. Because words aren't enough of a deterrent. Clay was then commissioned as a major general in the Union Army for the defense of Washington, D.C., and would facilitate the purchase of Alaska. With all of that context, now let's get into the alternate history scenario. In an alternate 1860 election, Cassius Clay is Abraham Lincoln's running mate. Nothing really changes in the 1860 in terms of Lincoln winning against the other two candidates because splitting the vote still occurs and there's no way Lincoln was going to get the South. Clay is very popular with abolitionists, and I feel like some in the South would claim voter fraud in the election because it's highly likely that on the campaign trail Clay would end up dueling and definitely fighting some slavery-loving wusses. The American Civil War still breaks out, and it's likely that the Confederates are even further pressing the slavery issue as Cassius abolition is non-negotiable Clay is the vice president. Clay would have definitely pushed for the Emancipation Proclamation to be part of Lincoln's platform upon entering office, and I feel like the South secedes and Clay would demand the Emancipation Proclamation to happen in 1861 right as secession occurs. This would definitely not sit well with the slavery-loving states of the Union from the start of the Civil War, but after the early setbacks of the Union and the successes at Vicksburg Campaign and the Western Theater, there's going to be no question of who's going to win the Civil War. The alternate Cassius Clay as vice president during the U.S. Civil War would probably want to duel someone in a border state to keep those states in line with the Union's war effort, and would definitely win as he's the undefeated duelist. Clay's actions would likely get states and groups that weren't sure about the Union's immediately policy of ending slavery to keep with the Union because this dude is just that epic. Regarding the idea of foreign intervention in the war, Clay would probably still be heavily invested in Russia's role in deterring the British and French intervention for the Confederates. Another aspect of foreign intervention that could be changed from Clay's position and changes as vice president would be Italy. In our timeline, President Lincoln had reached out to Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Garibaldi to become a general in the Union Army to suppress the rebels. However, Garibaldi refused due to Lincoln having not ended slavery at the time. Garibaldi also thought that Lincoln had wanted him to lead the entire Union Army as well, which he was very up for as long as Lincoln ended slavery. In this alternate timeline, the Union has ended slavery with Cassius Clay as vice president, and Garibaldi is more than happy to become a Union general, and he comes up with an army of revolutionaries under his command. Garibaldi's presence in the U.S. Civil War would have definitely filled any gaps in the Union's ranks that immediately came as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. It would have caused some border states and war Democrats to be a little iffy, but you know what? Garibaldi's here with all his guys. Also, Garibaldi is an excellent general, so that's also a huge factor in boosting the Union's war effort. In the 1864 election, I don't know if Lincoln would consider dropping Clay from the ticket in favor of Andrew Johnson due to getting support from the war Democrats. However, I feel like Cassius Clay could just as easily bully war Democrats into supporting the Republican ticket instead of McClellan, but that's just my thoughts. Also, Clay has also heavily secured the support of Italy and Garibaldi during the war, so there's that. No Andrew Johnson and Clay staying as VP, as Lincoln will definitely still win the 1864 election regardless. Now, the next thing that we gotta tackle is the death of Abraham Lincoln after the end of the Civil War. Clay being vice president likely has no impact on the fact that Lincoln is getting assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Other than that, the Southern conspirators would probably just as easily also really want to kill Cassius Clay because of Clay's prominent role in abolition and being an epic dude in general. Cassius Clay's presidency would likely be the exact opposite of Andrew Johnson's administration that we got in our timeline, where Johnson was buddies with a lot of Southern slave owners and went super easy on Reconstruction and rebuilding the South and allowing the Klan to be a thing. Clay was not overly popular with all of these Southern Democrats, and he keeps the occupation forces for Reconstruction. He was not a radical Republican like many pro-Reconstruction politicians, but he would certainly do a lot better job at handling the South than Johnson did, as Johnson was definitely one of, if not the worst president in American history. The South would probably see some light guerrilla movements and insurgency spike up like they had in our timeline, but this time the guerrillas have far more forces, but would also be heavily met with even more force. Other things that Clay would likely do in his administration would be increasing railroad expansion westward and buying Alaska in 1867. I could see Cassius Clay opting not to run for a second term in 1868, but I don't know how he'd feel at this point, in this alternate scenario where he's seen Lincoln be killed and he had been vice president for Lincoln and also helped win the Civil War. The post-Cassius Clay era would likely see Ulysses S. Grant, like in our timeline, become the next president. I don't really know much about how much is altered in Grant's administration due to these drastic changes to the immediate reconstruction of the South and in the Civil War without Andrew Johnson. But that is, of course, just one possible scenario for if Cassius Clay had become Abraham Lincoln's vice president in the 1860 election. 1800s history is not really my strong suit, as I'm more of a 20th century and 21st century kind of dude. But what do you think would have happened had Clay been Lincoln's vice president? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.